My name is Alana, and this is my presentation on the views and suppression of Gnosticism, created from researching books that will be included at the end. What I discuss in this presentation is not meant to be my opinion necessarily. I am sharing what I've learned to be the general consensus between the researchers that I have read. Although there are many different interpretations of the Gnostic texts and a lot of disagreements. So, as with anything, take what resonates and discard the rest. Also, I would just like to say that any statement I make about the Roman Church is strictly in relation to the leadership from Rome and is not a reflection on any Catholic, Christian, or person from Rome, or any single church. There is beauty in all beliefs. To quickly lay out what we'll be going over. First, we're going to start with a quick overview of the definitions related to Gnosticism so you can understand what I mean by this term. Then, we're going to go over a timeline of the formation of Gnostic and Orthodox Christianity. Then, we will be addressing the main universal beliefs in Gnosticism, which can be a little difficult to pinpoint exactly, because there is a variety of texts and a huge diversity of thought, as with any theology. We will also be covering some of the commonly agreed upon beliefs that just have some discrepancies between the stories. And lastly, we will discuss the contrasting beliefs and disputes in Gnosticism, because again, there is always disagreements. Always. Gnosticism, as a term, is very much disputed by academics, as it's both not clearly defined and a term that was derived from its critics, rather than one that any one group gave itself. Most Christians, people who followed Christ's teachings at this time, call themselves by a variety of names. For the purpose of this presentation, the term Gnosticism will be utilized broadly to characterize any religious movement based on gnosis, specifically within the time frame of the early Christian era. Even though this concept of gnosis predates this time, we are primarily focusing on the formation of Christianity, which is the first 1500 years of the Common Era. While researchers can't exactly say when Gnosticism first arose, there is proof that this theology was prevalent not only at the time of Jesus, but also that many of these teachings likely came directly from Jesus himself. Now, Oxford sets the start date of Gnosticism to the 2nd century, which places it well after Jesus' death. But that is only because of a long history of suppression and erasure of Gnostic texts and teachers. We had very little physical proof of them, except by the critics who railed against it. So that is why Oxford gives this somewhat misleading statement about its origin date. Thankfully though, the truth is coming out, because when I first began researching this just over a year ago, Oxford had this date in the 4th century. So we are going in the right direction. To expand a little further, in the early Christian era, there was no one Christian doctrine, as many of us who grew up in certain Christian institutions were taught to believe. Since there was no fixed canon or ritual established by institutions, Christianity was highly diverse, with many competing varieties, many of which are wildly different than what we currently know as Christianity. Gnosticism is one of those early varieties of Christianity, and had just as much claim to representing real Christianity as any belief did at that time. While Gnosticism does embody a variety of beliefs, the most crucial tenet is the belief in gnosis. Gnosis is commonly defined as just knowledge, but the major consensus amongst these writers is that Gnosis is used to represent insight, acquired from your intuition, and increased by knowing yourself, going within, and connecting to the divine, also called the universe. So while it is knowledge, it's just not from external sources, like research, but instead from knowing yourself internally and gaining insight, which Gnostics believe is received from the divine, as we are one with the divine. Gnosis is also sometimes used to mean awareness, particularly the awareness of self. Gnostics believed that one can attain Gnosis through internal contemplation, spiritual discipline, and by divine grace. To expand even further, the word Gnosis has to do a lot of work, because it represents several different concepts that don't have distinct words in English. So it has a variety of nuanced meanings depending upon the context. And of course, every person, even researchers, have their own personal interpretations of words. The general agreed upon meaning for Gnosis, though, is insight, received via your intuition. It is secondarily used to mean both self-awareness and also the path of attaining knowledge of the true nature of reality, which leads to salvation from ignorance. Essentially, a person is saved by reaching a higher and higher states of consciousness, by knowing the truth about who we ourselves are, the world we live in, and who the true God is. Gnosis and the practices in Gnosticism share a lot of similarities with the Eastern religions, such as how the progression through the stages of Gnosis will lead one to complete illumination, similar to enlightenment. Also, a Gnostic tries to liberate their soul from the suffering of the material world as they progress towards unity with the Source God. There are many other similarities as well. Like such how Gnosis is achieved through knowledge of oneself. This self-knowledge is gained by going within, observing ourselves, and increasing our self-awareness through meditation and other such practices. By going within, one is consciously activating the light presence within oneself and invoking the divine. By going within, we gain knowledge. By gaining full knowledge, we can achieve our light body and then be able to ascend back to the divine realm. To Gnostics and many Eastern religions, realization of the self means peeling away the ego, the fabricated layers of our own personality, to understand our true self and hence the true nature of reality. Once we know the core of who we are, we start to know the universe and the divine, because all life at its core is of the same substance. So unless one knows oneself, one can't know God. Once the self finally understands itself as it really is, it achieves liberation from any and all mundane circumstances and the pointless suffering that goes along with it. Gnosis can't just be obtained through outward social or institutional means alone, such as believing in creeds, observing the sacraments, or obeying the clergy. Gnosis is something that each individual has to experience internally for themselves. Some Buddhist groups state that everyone can become a Buddha. Similarly, in Gnosticism, everyone is and can become a Christ. Orthodoxy tried to make Christ consciousness as something special to Jesus, making an idol out of a man. From Gnostic perspective, Jesus, or as they called him, Yeshua, was an enlightened teacher, but very much still a man. Gnostics, for the most part, felt that anyone willing to engage in actual spiritual practice could evolve themselves towards greater consciousness. The essential aim of every Gnostic is to acquire gnosis for themselves and help others seek their truth. The most important discovery for our understanding of Gnosticism came from texts now called the Coptic codices that were buried around Egypt. They were buried to protect them from various times of destruction, from Rome primarily, such as during the Crusades, the pillaging of Alexandria, and when books were just straight banned by the church. For 2,000 years, Gnosticism has been entirely defined by its critics in Rome. So finding these books shedded much needed light on the nature and structure of Gnostic beliefs. These codices are named after the cities or people by which they were found, with the largest and most important collection referred to as the Nag Hammadi codices, which weren't found until 1945. As you will notice, most of these are dated to be written sometime after the 3rd century. However, the books within them were referenced by heresiologists much earlier. Therefore, these are just later editions of the earlier writings. Among the few codices that are still in existence, there are differences of perspective and philosophical points of view. Even within Nag Hammadi library, there are considered to be different schools of thought. Since Gnostics believed in following your own intuition to your own truth, then it would have been acceptable to have a diverse set of ideas to draw from. Considering the different range of ideas that was prevalent in the early Christian era, how did we get to just one set of Christian doctrine that is considered to be the canon? Before the discovery of the codices, how we understood Gnosticism was through the lens of Roman church leaders who deemed it heretical. It was the opinions of these heresiologists and others that would eventually determine what modern Christianity is. For the first several hundred years after Jesus, there was no set doctrine or creed for Christianity. However, it was these men's views that eventually became the canon. These men have all since been sainted, and there is no difficulty in finding their texts, even though we still cannot find many of the texts they spoke out against. This man Irenaeus will come up again, so make a note. He is the most influential of the heresiologists. Orthodox literally means correct thinking. Virtually all forms of modern Christianity, whether they realize it or not, go back to this one form of Christianity that emerged victorious from the conflicts over the centuries. This one form decided what was the correct Christian perspective. It decided who could exercise authority over Christian belief and practice. And it determined what other forms of Christianity would be marginalized, set aside, or destroyed. It decided which books to canonize into Scripture and which books to ban. As we know, history is written by the victors, and this case is no different. This party rewrote the history of the controversy, making it appear that there had been very minimal dispute, that any disagreement was over minute details, and that their own views had always been those of the majority of Christians, back to the time of Jesus, and that its opponents were just small fringe groups that wanted to deceive people into sin. Before the 4th century, before this Council of Nicaea, no one religious institution existed that enforced one single point of view, not counting, of course, emperors and their tendency to enforce their own belief system. This idea of a single correct view of Christianity arose in the city of Rome, whose elite often liked conformity and dominance. So they created their own version of Christianity that removed aspects that lessened their control. Once the correct doctrines were set, they then used the power of the imperial state to destroy texts that they now deemed heretical. This is believed to be when the Nag Hammadi codices were buried. Over time, there are dozens of councils and assemblies of the Roman Orthodox clergy, technically proto-Orthodox, meaning Orthodox before it was official. They set the standard for the correct Christianity, and in the process, Gnostic and mystic elements had to be stripped away. Elements like salvation through the self, or spiritual reincarnation, and woman's equality. For people would be less likely to submit to Roman rule if they were self-empowered. Most Gnostic followers of Christianity were annihilated, save for a relative few that would underground and form themselves into secret societies. The wonderful beauty of diversity that was found in the early centuries was all but destroyed, and Gnostic Christians were branded heretics. And heresy in Rome was equivalent to treason, as it was seen as an attack on the authority of the rulers, and was met with severe persecution, either exile or death. I find that it's helpful to have a timeline in order to understand how events affect each other. So we will start with the grandfathers of Gnosticism, the Essenes. The Essenes were a mystic Jewish sect that influenced Gnostic Christians through the teachings of Jesus, who was a disciple of the Essene, John the Baptist. Now, sometime in the early Common Era, Jesus was initiated into mystery schools, and like any good initiate, he headed east to Asia and spent time learning from the monks out in Tibet and India. Now to skip ahead a little, Rome executes Jesus as a seditionist, opposed to Roman occupation. The Bible canon downplays Roman involvement to make it seem like the Jewish people were the driving force and that Romans merely acquiesced. And while there were Jewish people who did want Jesus gone, their motivation was often out of fear of Roman retaliation. And ultimately, this decision and execution came from the Roman occupiers. To most Christians, Judas is seen as a traitor, the disciple who betrayed Jesus to the Romans. But the Codex Chacos portrayed a very different man. Judas is shown as one of Jesus' closest friends, asked by Jesus himself to betray him, to fulfill the prophecy, and liberate his soul to ascend to heaven. As Jesus needed to be removed from his physical body and return to his spiritual self in order to deliver his revelations more accurately to his disciples. According to this Gnostic text, Judas didn't want to betray Jesus, but was the only one who was strong enough to fulfill this difficult fate. After the fated kiss, and Judas either commits suicide or is murdered, depending upon the source, Matthias is chosen as the 12th disciple to replace Judas. His teachings are later referenced by major Gnostic teachers who say they learned from him. Apostle Paul is a Roman citizen, and he sets up his Christian church there. As anyone here who has grown up in Christian institutions knows, he is by far the most prevalent apostle in Christian canon. Half of the writings of the New Testament have been credited to him, but he is somewhat of a controversial figure, as he is not one of Jesus' disciples in Gnostic texts. In fact, he is rarely mentioned. He does seem to have been around, but was not in the in crowd, so to say. Also, in Paul's writings, he rarely actually quotes Jesus' words. It would not be going too far to say that Paul, and not Jesus, was the founder of Orthodox Christianity. Now Nero comes along and tries to execute all followers of Christ in Rome, among others. Paul's church, though, does keep going despite the opposition. Now comes the near total destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. This officially ends the Church of Nazarene, which Jesus founded, while the Church of Paul continues to grow. We don't know exactly when, but sometime between 70 to 100 CE, both the Gnostic and New Testament Gospels are written in Alexandria, Egypt, which is the intellectual heart of the Roman Empire. Now comes along Valentinus, the most popular Gnostic Christian theologian at his time. He was considered for the position of bishop in Rome, which is equivalent to the current pope. Despite his massive popularity, none of his works have survived the various purgings of heretical texts. Only his words, as written by his opponents, have survived. And speaking of his opponents, this is Irenaeus, that guy I mentioned earlier, the most prominent heresiologist of all time. He writes against heresy, which condemns the Gnostics and Valentinus strongly. This is the first recorded use of the word Gnostic, and interestingly, there is no difficulty in finding his writings, despite their similarity in time. Jesus' teachings are now spreading wildly throughout the Roman Empire. His followers are met with periods of severe persecution, sometimes peace, but mostly persecution from the various Roman emperors. Then comes the major destruction of the Library of Alexandria. While it is true that the library was in decline before this time, due to the various times of persecutions, this destruction still permanently removed books from our world heritage. According to Blavatsky, this is when all the original Gnostic texts were destroyed. The Romans have tried to blame it on the Arab invasion, but it was an act caused by themselves. At this point, the Roman emperor removes any legal rights for Christians and demands traditional religious compliance or death. The chief rival to Christianity in the first few centuries was Mithraism, which the emperors and aristocracy heavily favored at this time. Mithras was a sun god who was honored as the patron of loyalty to the emperor. So it is not surprising that it was preferred by the rulers. This goes on basically until the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. And then all religions become legal in Rome for a time. A few years later, Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea to establish a single creed and doctrine for Christian belief and practice. The clergy who participated were almost unanimously aligned with the same proto-Orthodox view. Thus, the council only served to further entrench their positions. The Nicene Creed is created and becomes a defining statement of beliefs of mainstream Christianity. This is where Jesus was decided to be divine and not just a man. To quote the Nicene Creed, "We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is of the essence of the Father. This means that Jesus is like God and no one else is." Now, Emperor Theodosius, or Theodosius, makes the orthodoxy of Nicene Christians the new state religion of Rome. This develops into the persecution, oppression, torture, and murder of huge amounts of people, whose belief and practices differed from the established Orthodox dogma and creed. Anything seen to threaten or contradict the authority of the emperor, and by extension the Roman Church, was put down and destroyed. Now is the First Council of Constantinople, held by the Roman Emperor and several hundred Orthodox clergy. They confirmed the Nicene Creed and expanded on some of the details. This created a power struggle between the Christian centers of Rome and Constantinople, with the Western Church of Rome claiming that they had supreme authority. This is the beginning of what will eventually lead to the East-West Schism in Christianity, which is a break in communion between the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodoxy. The same emperor ordered the Bishop of Alexandria to destroy all pagan monuments and manuscripts. This led to the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, as well as the remnants of the Library of Alexandria that were being held within. Now is the Third Council of Carthage, which ratifies what is the biblical canon. There have been other councils as well. We're just sort of hitting some of the major ones. Cyril, the Archbishop of Alexandria, the most powerful Orthodox Christian theologian in the world, incited his followers to murder Hypatia, the most famous Neoplatonist philosopher of the world. Neoplatonists at this time publicly rejected Gnosticism, which helped them escape persecution. But their beliefs are similar, minus some quibbles about the details. Hypatia's death marks the end of Gnostic thought in intellectual circles. Orthodox Christianity now reigns supreme. Here's yet another council to further define parameters for Christian doctrine, which is again followed by severe persecution of non-Orthodox beliefs. Gnostic groups are greatly reduced at this time. Next comes the Second Council of Constantinople. There are further edits and clarifications as to what is orthodox and what is heresy. This is when reincarnation of spirit was deemed heretical, and why we all grow up in Western society being told reincarnation is not real. Now's the First Crusades, launched by Pope Urban II of Rome. The stated goal was to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslims. These invasions solidified Roman control throughout Asia Minor. Now, in the 12th century, we see a reemergence of prominent Gnostic groups such as the Cathars, who stated that the Church of Rome was the church of materialism and Satan. Although unfortunately, as a response to them, Pope Lucius III ordered the Inquisition to find all heretics. Now, the death toll of the Inquisitions ranges somewhere between 30,000 to millions, depending upon the source. The sources I've used that are listed at the end lean to the higher end. Now, the Fourth Crusade is authorized by Pope Innocent III for Rome. This crusade is where crusaders from Rome sacked the city of Constantinople. Constantinople at this point was the seat of power of the Eastern Roman Empire, as the Western Empire had fallen some time back, and the city was considered to be the cradle of Orthodox Christianity. This crusade was widely regarded as a shocking betrayal of principles out of greed, but I think it's also important to note the differences in doctrine that existed between East and West at this point. The Crusaders pillaged and ransacked the Imperial Library, which contained the remnants of the destroyed Library of Alexandria. So this also feels like more capture and erasure of texts, not just greed, although definitely still greed as well. Pope Innocent III from Rome ordered the death of all heretics, which led to the destruction of huge Gnostic Christian communities that made up southern France and northern Italy. This includes the Cathars. Now are the first papal inquisitions. It's interesting that they call these papal inquisitions because the other inquisitions were also ordered by the Pope. And as always, the stated intent was to protect Roman Catholic doctrine from heresy. Council of Trent was the, quote, final edit that closed off any subtractions or additions, although there have still been plenty of evidence through translations and different editions over time. This man was the last official person killed in the Inquisitions. He was a schoolmaster in Spain. This is when the Inquisition was outlawed in many countries, such as Spain and Italy, which is where we get the stated end date of the Inquisition. However, the Holy See, the Vatican, has never officially ended the Inquisitions. They did dissolve the original department that, quote, defends Roman Catholic doctrine from heresy, end quote, but not until 1965. And then they immediately made a new department with the same purpose, and it is still functioning today. In fact, it was headed by Pope Benedict for decades. Now we're going to discuss some of the universal beliefs in Gnosticism. I almost hate to use this term, universal, because no group is a monolith, and almost all the specific details vary between the various texts, the critics' versions, and so on, which makes it difficult to make statements in the absolute. Yet even though many of the exact details vary, there are a few principles that are considered quintessential to Gnosticism. The big one, of course, is the belief in Gnosis, which we discussed earlier, but just to recap, It is used to represent both insight from your intuition and self-realization through self-knowledge. Also, the belief that gnosis brings salvation from ignorance, as lack of knowledge, called agnosis, is the root cause of entrapment in this material world. Someone who lacked this knowledge was called agnostic. We know that Orthodox Christianity has taught that our world is the good creation of the one true God, but that was not the view of the Gnostics. The Gnostic creation myth differs quite a lot from Genesis. And the Gnostic texts teach that the material world, that is, what we can observe, is not the true manifestation of existence. Instead, it is an illusion meant to distract us from the divine realms. The material world was created by a flawed creator god named Yaldabaoth, sometimes called Yaldabaoth, also called the Demiurge. And in his ignorance, he made a flawed world. The Demiurge was equated to the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is also the God of the Old Testament in the Bible. Gnostics believe that instead of a good world created by a perfect God, this is instead a broken world made by a broken, flawed creator. And salvation comes only to those who learn how to escape this world and its material trappings. Some Gnostics believe the Demiurge to be completely evil and intentionally malevolent, while others consider it to be ignorant but not malicious, while others believed it to be a necessary dark aspect that is part of the greater whole, and it's up to us not to fall victim to him. Another universal theme is the pleroma, which is akin to heaven. There is God, also called the monad, or the one, from which all existence emanates from, and which all existence desires to return to. In the beginning, there was only the source God. Then a number of divine dyadic beings called eons, sometimes called aeons, emanated from this source and populated this non-material dimension, called the pleroma, meaning the fullness. The pleroma is considered the true reality, and is where Gnostics aspire to return to. Gnostics believe that through gnosis, we could escape the prison that is the material world and return to the pleroma. Emanationism is a defining feature of Gnosticism. To emanate is to flow from. It means that all things proceed from the same divine substance, in a progression, where each reality arises from the previous one, and gets progressively less perfect as you increase its distance from the source. With the material world being the farthest level away from the source, according to Gnostics. I use this fractal as a representation of how the fractal energy comes from the source in the center. But as it emanates out, it changes progressively. All fractals form a series from the beginning source. The second fractal is an emanation from the first, the third from the second, and so on. At every step, the fractal is slightly changed from the original source. And even though the source gives rise to the other fractals, the source itself doesn't change or decrease. The belief in emanationism was a major contention with Orthodox, which taught that God created the world from nothing, so we are not of God, just a creation from nothing. In emanationist philosophies, we are all one with God, because we are emanations of God. However, separation is painful, so we seek to flow back to it, as Gnostics believe that all matter desires to return back to the Godhead, also known as God. Since everything emanates from God, we are all of the same essence. They call that essence the divine spark, and it is our direct connection to Source. Gnosticism states that humans are a mixture of both spiritual and physical beings. It says that humans were originally spiritual beings, or sparks of divine light from the pleroma, but we got trapped in the material universe, forming the combination of mind, body, and spirit that we are now. And we must endeavor to free ourselves and our brethren from the misery of matter. In order to escape from matter and ascend back to the divine realm, a Gnostic is supposed to acquire their light body, since we are beings of light. And through self-realization, we can become God, once we realize our own divinity. Now, those are the universal themes that I can say are pretty intrinsic to Gnosticism. But again, no group is a monolith. There is even a Gnostic group that believes Jesus is the evil interloper. I do want to touch on some common beliefs that are prevalent in Gnosticism, even if there are discrepancies about the details. Such as the Trinity, which varies a lot between sources, making it difficult to determine the exact Trinity of Gnosticism. Many sources would place God here, instead of or even as Bythos. And in most sources, Sophia is presented as the mother in this Trinity. But since she's also portrayed as the syzygy of Jesus, the feminine opposite of Jesus, I preferred this model with Barbelo as the mother, as it was less incestuous. Regardless of which female entity is placed here, the Gnostic Trinity is always about the mother, father, and child. Not just the Father, Son, and masculine Holy Spirit that is used in Orthodox Christianity, which completely cuts out the feminine aspect entirely. Gnosticism is a very female-driven religion, and two of the most understood eons are Sophia and Barbelo, especially Sophia. But first, let's start with Barbelo, as she was the first emanation from Source, or the monad. She is known as the mother goddess of creation, the mother father, the thrice androgynous, and other names. It should be noted that all eons have both a male and female aspect. Barbelo is sometimes used to represent the feminine aspects of God, and other times she is the wife of God. She is, however, always portrayed as the mother of all the eons, including Christ, who is considered to be an eon well before he incarnated into human flesh. All eons have dual concepts and pairings, and for Christ, his spiritual twin was often depicted as Sophia, who is the personification of wisdom. Sophia has been used as an emblem of wisdom for a wide variety of philosophies. Her name is even used in the word philosophy, meaning the love, philo, of wisdom, Sophie, or even theosophy, the wisdom of God. One of the many big things which separates the Gnostics from Orthodox Christians was that they viewed God as having a feminine aspect, as well as a masculine. Another big difference is that in Gnosticism, the Holy Spirit, also called the wisdom of God, is always portrayed as a feminine manifestation. She would have had a masculine side as well, but she was always in female form, likely because female energy is viewed as a receptive energy, and we receive our information, our wisdom, from the divine. Some of the times, the Holy Spirit is represented as Barbelo, but most of the times, it's portrayed as Sophia. Speaking of women in Gnosticism, women were generally equal in many Gnostic circles, and were given positions of power within their churches, which was almost unheard of at this time. The heresiologist Irenaeus even noted that women were especially attracted to Gnostic groups. He was quite irate about it, especially after one of the wives of his own deacons joined the group of the Gnostic teacher Marcus. As Irenaeus proclaimed, to quote, "Even in our own district, Marcus has attracted many foolish women." Irenaeus was totally at a loss for why women might prefer these Gnostic groups, so he could only offer one explanation, which was that Marcus himself was a diabolically clever seducer, a magician who compounded special aphrodisiacs to deceive, victimize, and defile his prey. Another pro-woman deviation from Orthodox is that Gnostic texts state that Jesus had multiple women disciples, with Mary Magdalene being his closest and most dearest one. She was known as the Apostle to the Apostles. Mary Magdalene is mentioned more in the Gnostic Gospels than his own mother Mary. Jesus speaks of Mary Magdalene very highly, as he states that Mary Magdalene will bring light to the world and inherit the kingdom of light. In one of the Gnostic texts, Mary Magdalene is chosen along with Thomas and Matthew as one of the 3 disciples to receive special teachings. And Jesus even praises her above the other 2. To quote him, she spoke as a woman who understood everything. Another badass female figure in Gnostic texts is Noria, who is Adam and Eve's daughter, a wise woman who marries a good-intentioned but not very perceptive man named Noah. According to the Gnostics, it was the demiurge who convinced Noah to build his ark, while Noria tried to persuade him to not cooperate with him. At one point, she even burns down the ark created by Noah. The demiurge tries to rape Noria as punishment, but she calls to the true God and is saved by being granted gnosis. Her and her family are then placed in a luminous cloud by the true God and are saved from the floodwaters. The creation myth is by far the most prevalent Gnostic text that we have found, meaning there are more copies of it than any text, which speaks of its importance to early Gnostics. Because there are more copies of this one than any other text, there are also more discrepancies in the details. But regardless of the differences, there are consistent threads that are present in all of them. So without getting too caught up in the specifics, let's get into it. The Gnostic creation myth describes the fall of Sophia and the creation of man. Remember that all aeons emanate from the source God, and the further away from the source, the more imperfect they become. Sophia was considered to be the lowest eon, because she was the furthest removed from the source. Some stories say that she wanted to emanate on her own, while others say she was lonely and wanted a child. Although I think this comes from a misinterpretation of what emanation is. Regardless, she tried emanating or procreating without her counterpart, her male half. And in doing so, she fell out of communion with the other eons and became trapped in the material universe. In her distress, she accidentally created a being from herself, referred to as the demiurge, or Yaldabaoth, who we saw earlier with the lion's head and the snake body. The demiurge was an ignorant, foolish, jealous creature that was utterly unlike the other heavenly beings. Sophia realized her horrible mistake, and in shame tried to hide it by sealing it in a shining cloud. The arrogant demiurge, unable to perceive the other expressions in the divine, believed himself to be the highest being. In his arrogance, the demiurge wanted to rule, so he created our world and 7 archons to help him administer his reign. Archons are the negative polarized versions of the eons. Both are akin to angels, so you can think of them kind of like the light and dark angels, the yin to the yang. Since the demiurge is ignorant and unable to connect to the divine, our world came out corrupted, and it is a far inferior version to the divine model. Sophia was devastated. She felt immense guilt for creating such a monstrous entity. She prayed and was granted forgiveness. However, she had lost part of her power. She had passed on part of her divine spark to the demiurge, and she was no longer her full self. So she could not enter the pleroma, the fullness. She would need to gain it back from the demiurge to become whole again before she could return. Sophia is deemed to reside in the 9th layer of planetary spheres or heavens, the layer of sky closest to the pleroma and right above the demiurge, with the 7 archons populating the 7 heavenly spheres below them. Meanwhile, the demiurge and his archons were sent an image of the heavenly Adam from the divine realm. They didn't know where it had come from, but they were enthralled by it. They decided to attempt to create a human being for themselves. All the archons built a piece of Adam and put him together. but he lay lifeless on the ground, and they couldn't figure out how to animate him. Sophia gave the demiurge the insight to breathe his spirit, his divine spark, into Adam. The demiurge did so, and Sophia's power flowed out of him and into Adam, bringing the first man to life. Because of Sophia's power within Adam, he was already wiser, more spiritual, and more intelligent than the archons. Out of jealousy and resentment, the archons decided to make Adam mortal. They placed him in the Garden of Eden, which they filled with all kinds of delicious foods and revelries to make him attached to material pleasures, so as to distract him from his divine nature. The archons, wanting to possess Adam's divine insight for themselves, took it out of Adam and created a new being to house it named Eve. When Adam saw her, he instantly recognized her as his spiritual counterpart. Now, we know that Orthodox taught us that Eve listened to the evil serpent and ate the forbidden fruit, and this led to the fall of man. However, in the Gnostic myth, the serpent is viewed as a wise creature who strives to awaken humans to their higher knowledge. At Sophia's urging, through the snake, Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, and their eyes were opened, a metaphor for gnosis, and they grew in their understanding of their superiority over their creators. By eating the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve became enlightened and turned away from the demiurge, who was now boiling with hatred and envy. As punishment, the demiurge expelled them from the garden. So in the Gnostic creation myth, the fruit of knowledge represents gnosis and is something we want to attain. It is only the broken creator who wants to control us and prevent us from gaining that wisdom. Now, I found this picture while looking for art, and I was surprised by how clearly Gnostic it is, especially given its location within the Vatican. Notice how the snake is clearly a woman, which is certainly not canon. And just look at these expressions. It's definitely giving women helping women. And the snake and this angel, possibly Archon, are absolutely being contrasted here. And who here is helping, and who is implementing brutal, oppressive control? I couldn't immediately find anyone who had noticed this as well. I mean, I am confident someone has noticed this, but it doesn't seem to be in popular mainstream understanding yet. So when Dan Brown makes a book about this picture, I want you all to remember you saw it here first. Now, if you don't believe Michelangelo would so obviously refute the church, then let me show you Exhibit B. Scholars have noticed that this angel is definitely flipping the Pope off with a Renaissance equivalent of the finger. This is Pope Julius II, and this picture is situated directly over the Pope's seat. Now notice the rebellious smirk on this angel's face too. Michelangelo was definitely the Renaissance's Banksy. Continuing on with the creation myth, after Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, the demiurge rapes Eve. 2 sons were born from this tragic intercourse, Cain and Abel, also called Yahweh and Elohim. These names will sound familiar to some of you, as these names have been translated as just alternative names of God in the Old Testament. The rest of the story of Cain and Abel is the same, but according to Gnostics, Adam and Eve also had a son of their own, an enlightened boy who they named Seth. And eventually they will have their daughter as well. The demiurge couldn't bear that there were now more beings in his creation that were enlightened and superior to him. He forced them to drink the water of forgetfulness, so that they would lose their gnosis. But the capacity to revive gnosis lay dormant within them, since the demiurge wasn't capable of expunging it completely. And so Gnostics believe that their spiritual descendants among humankind remain capable of regaining that saving illumination. Jesus spoke in metaphors and parables, and this is apparent in the New Testament as well as the Gnostic texts. So then, what do these stories mean on a deeper level? Sophia allegorically represents the imprisonment of the soul in the world of matter, and its liberation to the world of the spirit. Sophia's fall corresponds to the human intellect, trying to be wise on its own, without the insight imparted by divine grace. Left to our own devices, us humans would inevitably go astray, because our own thoughts lack the fullness of the divine, and are therefore woefully deficient. Essentially, when we gain knowledge outside of ourselves, and not from insight, it's fallen wisdom, not true wisdom. This inevitably creates unnecessary problems for us and for others, just as Sophia's independent action led to her exile from heaven and the creation of a horribly flawed world. The solution in this view would be to acquire gnosis, the insight and wisdom gained from the divine. Those with gnosis will ascend to the pleroma after their deaths to partake of the perfect fullness. The Gnostic who has been saved and has rejoined the pleroma would thereby find themselves in the same position as the saved Sophia, as the possessor of true wisdom. Allegorically, the demiurge represents the ego illusion, which produces the state of dualistic consciousness and thus the illusion of separation of ourselves from life, each other, and God, which gives rise to desire and suffering. The appearance of separation in consciousness is called cosmic ignorance, which on one hand facilitates individuality and unique experiences, but on the other hand prevents realization of the underlying sacred unity. Cosmic ignorance gives rise to the ego, that sense of self-independence and self-existence apart from creation and the divine being. While the demiurge represents the ego, the archons represent the negative aspects that arise from the ego, such as pride, arrogance, envy, greed, fear, anger, hatred, doubt, and others. Therefore, the ego is the cause of our sorrow and suffering, and the way to fix that is to acquire divine insight, do good works, have a good heart, and eliminate the ego. Essentially, we can only perceive the ultimate truth if we move beyond the ego and external knowledge, and instead go within and embrace our connection with the divine to attain self-realization. Now to talk about some discrepancies. In research circles, there is always disagreement, about every topic, but especially in areas like metaphysics. Disagreements like whether Gnosticism is dualist or non-dualist. Although before I expand on that further, it's important to know that there are many schools of thought that use the term dualist. Gnosticism might be considered dualist in one school of thought, but non-dualist in another, or sometimes even both, because one group is never a monolith. I don't want to get too far into the philosophical weeds, since I am not a philosopher, so we're only going to shallowly address just the one school that is dualism versus non-dualism, as we know it from Hindu philosophy, Dvaita and Advaita. Most experts claim all Gnostic traditions are inherently dualistic in their view. This is a reasonable conclusion, given that every being in the world has dual aspects, as well as the dichotomy between the evil creator and good source God. And of course, there are absolutely Gnostic sects that would have considered themselves dualist. The Gnostics drew a sharp contrast between the material world in which we live and the spiritual realm of the immortal aeons. But strictly speaking, dualists believe in two eternal and opposed ultimate principles, from which the opposing realms of matter and spirit originate, that the two halves are inherently equal, like two sides of the same coin. And while some Gnostic groups do qualify as dualist, most of the texts actually place Source God as an infinitely superior being to the demiurge, and not as an equal opposite. Also, since Gnosticism is inherently an emanationist philosophy, that means that there is only one Source God, and everything that exists emanated from it. Therefore, all substance comes from the One and seeks to return to the One. So the material world is not foreign to the divine realm, but rather a lower imperfect emanation of it. Since we are all from the One, are of the One, and seek to return to the One, that implies a certain oneness that is more aligned with non-dualism. Because of this, there are researchers that believe that Gnosticism is a non-dualist philosophy. This is more aligned with what I think, but we are not in the majority perspective. So if you feel differently, go with that. Similar to Hinduism, there are many texts and different interpretations, so reasonable people can come to a different conclusion. Sophia has two aspects, not just wisdom but faith. As such, she's commonly referred to as Pistis Sophia. Pistis meaning faith. Although not faith in any belief or religion, but faith arising in one's inner knowing, our insight. For the more faith that we give our insight, our intuition, the stronger the signals and messages become. We are constantly filled with doubt, in no small part because of society, which has formulated itself from controlling regimes and religions. Because of this, we've been kept down and have learned to keep ourselves down. Pistis Sophia reminds us to have faith in ourselves, in our intuition, and with that we can gain more wisdom. If there is one thing I would really impress upon you all, is to have faith in yourself and your own intuition. Avoid the traps of ego as best you can, but still trust yourself. Alright, here are the books that I used for this research. There are many more books than just these. These are just the ones that I could get to. There really is a wide variety of opinions and perspectives out there. This was just my conclusion from these books. Thank you all for your time. Be well. Love and light.